Good morning. My name is Fatima Adam from the Xenex Foundation, and I'll be facilitating this literacy breakaway session with you today. We know literacy is critically important and is the sort of backbone upon which all learning takes place. And we also know that in South Africa, we are facing literacy performance issues across the board. But we also know that over the past few years, we've been developing a strong body of evidence and knowledge through a range of experts who have been thinking very hard about literacy issues in the country. And we've got 4 of those experts on our panel to share some of their key ideas with you. The 4 panelists are Lekhethi Makalela. He's a professor at Wits University focusing on what he refers to as trans-languaging, which is a very difficult word, which he will then explain. It's Yandiswa Kaza, and she is the CEO of Nalebali, and we all know Nalebali promotes reading, leisure reading activities. And there's Nwankubela Maliza, and she is coming on shortly, and she is a literacy expert based at VW South Africa. And then Lily Pretorius, also a professor of linguistics. But before the panel quickly 5 minutes opening statements to present their pitch on the topic at hand, and this will be followed by Q&A questions. I just want you to note that the chat is disabled, so you would have to put your questions into the Q&A section of the Zoom. Also, you can participate in a poll on literacy that's taking place, and we will reveal these results just before we close this session. Please be succinct though on the questions that you ask, and specific references, make specific references to the speakers that you would like to respond. So before we waste any more time, let me introduce you, let me start with the first speaker, who is Lekhethi. And I'll start by saying, Lekhethi, you believe in breaking the linguistic boundaries, developing what I think is a more eclectic way on an approach to literacy. Can you explain a little bit about what that means, and in fact, why you believe it works? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to have this conversation. My initial opening statement is, yes, indeed, there are lots of billions of money that are put into the education system by NGOs, the corporate, the government, nationally and internationally. But it doesn't seem to work, because our view of literacy somehow is fundamentally flawed. We have abstracted literacy as a thing that you have or you don't have, instead of looking at literacy as something that is socially situated. In other words, it is a way of being, a way of knowing, and a way of doing. I see texts as props of the day-to-day, the real business of face-to-face interactions. In fact, they are simply props. So it works. What doesn't work is that we have not yet understood how the children, the teachers, the background, the context, how do they come to know? In other words, we haven't really asked that question. And I want to start from that premise that if we think about, we ask the question, how do they come to know? We are going to find out that, in fact, we need to step back a little bit and think about how African languages actually behave. What type of literacy practices that can be derived from the nature, the typology of an African language. We haven't. So far, we version everything from English. In fact, the things about syllabification the ba, be, bi, bo, bu methodology that we still have got in the system, and the overemphasis on phonological awareness completely missed the big picture about how first these languages behave, but secondly, the understanding that literacy is essential and foremost a culture. So I propose the eclectic approach, which is transliteracy from translanguaging, where you look at, for example, a paragraph system in English, which prefers a linear approach, the hierarchy, where you start with a topic sentence and then you support that. That is a culture, that is a particular way of knowing, which works best for other individuals. But African languages, on the other hand, are reader-responsible languages. The duty of the reader to figure it out. Deliberately and intentionally, you are vague because that's your way of knowing. So the real challenge is that the curriculum gives no space for what you call African language-based literacies. And I cannot see how we can change literacy in this country in an African context unless we come to step back and say, how do these people actually come to know? Because at the end of the day, it's not the letters and the sounds. Those are props of the actual way in which someone come to make sense. And I think that's my challenge, and that's what I wanted us to think about in this session today. There's a lot that I could say, but in the interest of time, my contention here is that we are not teaching African children in particular literacy in the way that is situated. In other words, what you call skills should be embedded within the social practices of these individuals. So school and home are decontextualized, are abstracted, are so much of two different worlds. We can save a lot of money and save children and begin to really take a step back and say, let's look at African language-based literacies, but in fact, the transliteracy, you have got the English, and how do you infuse? We don't even have that type of consciousness, because what we are doing is versioning, and I think the curriculum is a big, in fact, the questions that we ask, we say, how can we improve the children's ways of, in literature? How can we intervene with regard to the teachers? How can we, all of those are about adding stuff into the system. They're not about how do they come to know? What is the curriculum saying about how people come to know? Because if the curriculum is flawed, there's very nothing that we can ever do. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Aketi. That's spot on time. I think I'm going to allow all the speakers to go through, and then we're going to come up with questions. So the next one would be Yandiswa. Your organization focuses very heavily on reading, leisure reading, and I think there's a lot of contestation around why leisure reading is so important as opposed to all the structural sort of learning that needs to take place through pedagogy. Can you explain to us why, in fact, it is so important? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So let me jump straight to it. You're right about the contention. There's definitely quite a bit of that. But Nalibali has primarily 3 key focus areas. And so as an organization, we believe in the power of reading, and everything starts with a story. And those 3 focus areas are: 1, improving reading perceptions and behaviors through our mass media campaign. And that's just one strand. But the second part of that is making reading material accessible for children in languages they actually speak and understand, and not just in English. And then the third one is sparking a culture of reading in communities through our reading clubs. And that's where a lot of the embedding happens, and that's where a lot of the bringing it home happens in our reading clubs. So with Nalibali having these three key focus areas that definitely speak to each other, because it doesn't help us to inundate communities with reading material, even if it is in languages that those communities speak and understand, if we have not made a case for reading as something that is important and as something that sits outside of the school as well. And that's where the joy of reading comes in, because we are not too concerned with the mechanics of reading and teaching children how to read. We want to embed a culture of joy, of love, of excitement around reading, and make sure that it's not something that is located in a specific space only, but that it is something, it is a holistic thing. So how do we reach communities? And this was the area, the question that I was asked to respond to as well. How do we reach these communities to inspire a passion for reading? So we've established the biggest number of community-based reading clubs in the country. We currently have just over 5,000 reading clubs with a total of 160 children that are actively attending those reading clubs. And this was an effort really to create space for children to engage with text and storytelling at a very young age, or from a young age. We also have a network of over 30,000 literacy activists across the country. And these are really just people, volunteers in communities, reading club leaders, teachers, ECD practitioners, and really a committed group of people who are interested in the literacy space in South Africa. And this is a network of people we can draw on. They are on our platforms as Funda leaders that we can call on to support, to spread the word, or to start reading clubs. And there's a lot of training that also embeds that network of literacy activists. So we are very strong in our communities, and one of the themes there is that we want story-powered communities, not just story-powered schools or story-powered ECD centers, but story-powered homes and story-powered caregivers. So a reading club is a channel through which we achieve that. So we had an external evaluation that was done in 2019, last year, and it defined regular attendance in a reading club as once a week for at least 45 minutes. And in 72% of our reading clubs that participated in that evaluation, children were actually attending reading clubs regularly. And reading clubs have an average of 30 children per reading club. And reading clubs are also, they're located in different spaces. So a language teacher in a school can start a reading club, or a preschool teacher can start a reading club, but we also have them in churches, in community centers, in homes, in libraries, and even in churches. So it's just one of the ways in which we can almost infiltrate communities in a somewhat structured way to make reading fun and exciting. But what outcomes have we seen from these efforts? So one main outcome that came out from that specific report most recent was that some of the changes most frequently reported were children are spending more time reading for enjoyment, and their reading skills are actually improving, coupled with an increase in confidence when it comes to engaging with text and with reading. All right, I think I have run out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also much on time. Thank you.
Sure. Fatima, you're on mute.
Sorry, now we go to the third speaker, Nongubela, who is at VWSA. And I want to understand why VWSA chose literacy and what in fact you're doing in literacy that you think is working. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Fatima and Trialogue for inviting me on this panel. And I'd just like to start with a disclaimer to say that I am not a literacy expert, unlike everybody else on this panel. We as Volkswagen, and I also am just a big, big believer in literacy, not just as the key to quality education, as the title of this panel is, but I mean, we believe that literacy, and I'm sure I speak for everybody on this panel when I say that it's a basic human right, okay? It's an essential driver of learning and personal development, you know? It's a cornerstone of economic, social development and of modern, progressive, prosperous, and productive, you know, economies. But also more importantly, it's a driver of social cohesion, we believe, and also, you know, a pillar of good citizenship and personal well-being. And I think everybody's familiar with all the studies, the global studies that show the very high correlation between high literacy rates, high and increasing literacy rates, and a decrease in social ills, such as crime and poverty that plague us in South Africa. So that is why, and you know, an inverse relationship, or rather also a positive correlation between high literacy and high employment rates and high income levels. So that is why we as a corporate are really interested in driving literacy, because we believe that the more literate our societies are from an early age, the better societal outcomes there will be. And if there are better societal outcomes, then, you know, all of us will do better. So we think that literacy needs to be reframed and elevated in importance in terms of resource allocation, you know, and reframed as something actually of national importance and priority, because it's a driver of all the good outcomes that are required in society. I mean, there's a UNESCO report that said that was talking about the really poor educational outcomes in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Africa in particular. And it says that the problem is not necessarily a shortage of funds or deficit in effort, but rather that we are not working, we are working apart instead of together. And so we need to have more, as corporates with NGOs, and we need to have more sustained collaboration, you know, in driving literacy, and therefore improved outcomes in South Africa. So we think, I mean, we as Volkswagen have been investing in education for a long time, you know, ever since, you know, Volkswagen has been in South Africa for almost 70 years now. It'll be 70 years next year. And almost from the start, we've been investing in education. But more and more, we saw that the returns in terms of the educational investments, the returns that we were getting were suboptimal. And we were, in the beginning, we used to invest in tertiary education, giving bursaries, and we worked our way down, you know, to investing lower down the chain, until eventually we found that the single biggest obstacle to, you know, but yet most solvable obstacle to educational outcomes in South Africa was the fact that, you know, we have such poor literacy outcomes in the early years. So in 2016, Volkswagen established, over and above all our educational interventions, we established what we call our Legacy Literacy Initiative. And the aim of this initiative is to ensure that all learners in the Uitenhage, Greater Uitenhage area are functionally literate by the time that they are 10 years old. So we've been running this initiative now for a number of years. It's a comprehensive and multifaceted program. We work with a number of partners, including Nalibali, Funda Wande, Shine, and many other partners. The Department of Education, obviously, is an important stakeholder. But some of the key insights that we, you know, that are coming to, that we're learning on this journey is, the first thing that we, you know, we want to say, and to exhort other corporates, you know, over and above the fact that all of us have to elevate literacy in terms of our educational spend, and give it prominence, but it's the fact that we really have to invest in the things that work, okay? we have to invest in rigorous programs that really are able to produce learners that are able to read and write for meaning and enjoyment in an objectively measurable way. When we started our intervention, we did a benchmark survey. We surveyed grade 3 learners in the Uitenhage survey. And I mean, it was...
A few seconds left, sorry.
It was quite a devastating finding, because less than 50, just about 50% of them were able to recognize the 26 letters of the alphabet at grade 3 level. So basically, I mean, we really are saying that we need to invest in programs that work. There are many programs out there that are fun and maybe even beneficial for the recipients, but they don't really result in learners that are able to read and write by grade 4. We also have to invest in mother tongue literacy. We believe that that's a key driver of literacy in English as well. And most of our learners, as you all know, start the first 4 years of school in African vernacular languages and then move on to English. And then thirdly and finally is teacher capacity and the in-classroom interventions, because that is a key driver of, final literacy. So I'm going to stop there. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to see, I'm looking for all the questions in the Q&A, and Christian, I can't seem to see them, but in the meantime, I'm going to, I'm just going to continue with the panel and get our last speaker, but if you can just help me locate those questions from the audience. Our last speaker in this panel is Lily Pretorius. Lily, you just recently published in a bigger publication of sharing lessons from around the world. Can you share a few, maybe 2 or 3 of those seminal lessons that that you found or that works around the world in terms of literacy interventions and improving literacy outcomes?
Hi, Fatima. Thank you. Hi, everyone. First of all, before I talk about the 3 lessons learned, I just want to point out 3 conditions that are needed for successful reading to develop. That's access to texts. You can't learn to read if you don't have text to read in a language. The second one is opportunities to read. Developing reading doesn't just happen overnight. It takes several thousand hours of reading over many years to become a highly skilled reader who reads at, who can really comprehend at depth. And thirdly, in the initial stages, you really need knowledgeable teachers who can help children on this trajectory. So those are 3 basic conditions needed for successful reading. We also do know that it's really important and it's much easier to learn to read in a familiar language. So home language instruction is very important, especially in the first 3 years of life. But that's not a causal factor, it's a consequence. In South Africa, we already have over 75% of primary schools doing mother tongue instruction. And at the end of grade 3, children still can't learn to read and write. So simply having mother tongue instruction doesn't make it happen. You have to come back to, is there access to text? Are there opportunities to read? And are there knowledgeable teachers? So to come to the 3 lessons that I was thinking about, I think the first important lesson that we've learned from research, I would say in the past 20 years into early literacy, is really understanding the broader context. Over half of the children worldwide do not learn basic numeracy and literacy skills in the first 4 years of schooling. And in sub-Saharan Africa, 9 out of 10 children cannot read with minimum proficiency. So who are these children who don't get off to a successful start in reading? Well, if you look around the world, there are children who come from South America, Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and India. And they come from low and middle income countries. And then you need to ask yourself, well, what do all those continents and those countries, those low and middle income countries have in common? That seems to exacerbate this ability to get children off to a successful start. And they have 5 things in common. Poverty is widespread. Poverty per se doesn't make you stupid or anything. There's nothing wrong with children who come from poor homes. It's the barriers to learning that poverty puts up. And so it's really important to understand high poverty contexts and education in high poverty contexts. The second thing is that literacy levels in the adult population are not as high as they are in high income countries. And this has implications for what happens in the home and the kind of support that children get and the access they have to text in the home. Thirdly, multilingualism is common. Multilingualism is a very positive factor, but one needs to understand the mechanisms of multilingualism and the different purposes they serve between oral, everyday interactions and the kind of knowledge, what Leketi referred to as props. But those props in the education context are sources of new knowledge. So learners typically in these contexts acquire literacy in more than one language. The language of school might be completely different from the language of home. And the difference, the distance between the standard written forms, because literacy is conservative, it requires a fairly standardized form of language. Whereas spoken language is very open-ended, it changes constantly, it's very dynamic. The distance between standard forms of school language and the language spoken at home are quite wide very often. And you see this especially in countries like the Middle East with standardized Arabic, for example, and the kind of Arabic spoken at home. The fourth factor that they have in common is the teachers are not well trained and they themselves are very seldom voluntary readers. They don't read a lot. And fifthly, print resources in the local languages are usually very limited. So understanding that kind of context is really important, because if you get off to a bad start in literacy, what happens is cracks appear very early. Cracks appear in preschool already, before kids come to school, and they occur through the first 3 years of schooling. If you don't attend to the cracks, they develop into gaps, and gaps turn into chasms, and kids fall into chasms and don't come out of chasms. So it's really important in education systems in these kind of contexts for teachers to be able to pick up those literacy cracks from the beginning and attend to them. In wealthy countries where you've got highly trained teachers, they pick up the cracks very quickly and they help the children.
Lily, you've got seconds.
So, okay, the next really important thing is, the second lesson is quality teaching and improved teacher training. And this can happen at pre-service level, how universities and teachers training colleges train teachers to teach reading, and for in-service development. And we do know from research in developing countries that for in-service interventions, as Nonkabela said, you really need evidence-driven interventions, ones that are practical and that really work. And here, lesson plans, structured lesson plans, lots of resources, and giving teachers a lot of support. So coaching is a model that really helps. It's more expensive, but it works. And then finally, print resources are very important.
Your time is fully up.
Okay, right. Print resources, as Yandiswa says.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much for that. I'm just trying to think about how time is so tight. I think I'm going to ask each one of you to give one sort of a minute statement to answer one of two questions. So the one is, how do we deal with literacy issues post-COVID? And that I'm going to pitch at Lily, and very, very brief. Leketi, if we saying the curriculum has to be changed, then should we bother with all these training programs, because we're putting millions into it? And like VW and ourselves, are we making a mistake? Should we stop and focus on curriculum policy change? And then I think, yeah, I suppose the other speakers can also focus on dealing with a little bit with COVID, like leisure reading. How is it going to help us in COVID? Because we've lost what is structured learning time. And yeah, so if you can just quickly comment on those matters. I'm going to start quickly with Leketi. You've got like 30 seconds.
Okay. Thank you so much. There is, we know if we go at this rate, we know that had been a lot of money going to the system. We know billions and billions of money are pumped in, and they'll continue to be pumped, but we also know that that is not effective. So we are actually disinvesting. We need to go to the basics and say, how do these learners come to know? It's not in their DNA that they're not smart, they're not clever enough, and that our teachers are horribly bad, that the professors who produce the teachers are horribly bad. There's something fundamentally wrong about our understanding of literacy, and we need to get to that bottom line. Yes, change the curriculum, that is the first point.
Okay, thank you. Mangubela, I'd like you to go next. The same question is because you focusing on putting millions of rands like us into training. How, in fact, will you deal with this matter that Leketi says, actually, nothing's going to happen if we don't sort out some of these fundamentals like curriculum, because the curriculum borrows from English?
I mean, I think the curriculum needs to be changed to focus more on literacy and early stage literacy adoption, because we know that if you have learners that are fully functionally literate by the time they are 10 years old, all other educational outcomes will be positive. So we've got to make sure to invest in the mechanics, in the understanding, and in making sure that teachers can teach children to read. And even if that's all they do up until they're 10 years old, then I think the curriculum will have changed for the better, and that all the money that we put into education will yield positive results. So for me, I still believe that without getting children to read and write for understanding in a sustainable way, everything else we do is a waste of, arguably a waste of time.
Okay, so I'll go now. Thank you. I'll go now to Yandiswa. I mean, I think that we know that the love and culture around reading is important, but we also know that the structural components that lead children systematically to learn to read and teachers' capabilities are also key. How do you, so in a sense, should we prioritize? If we've got little money, should we prioritize one or the other?
Thank you, Fatima, for that question. So for me, I don't think it's one or the other. I think they reinforce each other, right? In a classroom school context, and we've had this debate for some time, where at school, the concern is, can this child read? We just want this child to be able to read, and we can use different methodologies to get the child to read. But beyond them then being able to read for meaning, hopefully, because just being able to read does not mean that a child can read for meaning. But beyond that, how do you then further embed this culture that it doesn't end there? And for us, it's also just an understanding that, it's not just leisure reading. It's literacy, it's fully comprehensive in the sense that when you read a child a story, there's elements of recall. So what did the donkey do? And the child has to speak, so the language practice back to you and share what they understood. But the critical thinking elements, what might have happened if this had actually occurred in the story? The imagination, the using your own thinking. So there's so much more. And I think there is a tendency to think that, reading for joy is just reading for joy, and there's no learning that embeds it. And there is some level of pedagogy that underlies all of that as well.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Lily. Lily, my question to you is, how do we deal with the backlogs on literacy now post-COVID? Or is that not even an issue? It's all been the same, it remains the same. What do you think?
Well, I would imagine, what would post-COVID look like? I assume that children will be going back to school. So I think there's a lot of the same, we need to continue teaching children in effective and realistic ways that do yield good outcomes. But there's also a sense of urgency. A lot of our kids have, they've been weak to start off with, and now they really have fallen behind. So I think there's also a kind of sense of urgency. We just can't let these things just like, you know, it'll all come right on its own. Kids don't just learn to read on their own if left to their own devices. I think what Yandiswa is saying is that joy of reading, that culture of reading, must be truly embedded in our schooling system as well. But the explicit teaching of reading also needs to happen. So it's a combination of explicit teaching, getting the mechanics right, so that children can become independent learners, doing a lot of extensive reading and teaching them explicit strategies that help them with their critical thinking skills. And if we ever have to go back down, let's hope we don't, into a kind of semi-lockdown, in some kind of blended learning. But we do know that the haves who have access to IT yes. and all that, have access to print resources, are going to benefit. So it's just, I think that la lotta continua, you know, the battle continues. But a lot of the basics haven't changed.
Okay, thank you. Before I make some closing statements, I just wanted to, you know, we did a poll, and the poll was about whether which interventions you think are most effective in driving literacy development. And we've just received the results of the poll. So it's clear that the majority is saying it's supporting parents and communities, followed by training and mentoring teachers and national reading campaigns, which are on par. And then at the lowest end, we've got school leadership support and training and mentoring district officials. Now, I would have loved to have a debate about this, because there's so many issues about what parents can do and then what schools can do and what are the kind of key leverage points. But I think we're getting to a close, because we needed to close at around 12. And I just wanted to summarize some of the key things that you guys have presented to this in the session. The one is that literacy is a complex and multifaceted problem, that we need multifaceted solutions. So leisure reading, but structured work at home, that there's an idea of conditions for success, which is text, opportunities, and teacher knowledge, and that curriculum policy needs to be dealt with in order for us to be able to improve the literacy outcomes that we have. And then finally, I think as a whole, is to bring evidence to bear on the problem so that we can inch away at the problem to get better and better solutions. So I thank you very, very much for this literacy session. It's a pity that it was so short and we couldn't delve more in details around many of the issues, and particularly around the poll, where people are saying go for parents and communities, when in fact their most projects are sitting with teacher development and those areas. So I thank you very much. Yeah, and I enjoyed the session very, very, very much. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you,
Bye.
Fatima. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Fatima. Bye.
Thank